My name is Cesare Cuzzola, pronouns he, him. I am the current coordinator of the network, and I'm also a research associate at RCMG at the University of Leicester. And it's my pleasure to host the final panel of the QHCN Symposium 2025. We have got 3 presentations, Tim Jerrome, Friday Schoemaker, and the English Heritage team, Celine, Elliott, Simon Clark, and Lauryn Etheridge today. Without further ado, I want to invite Tim Jerrome from University of Brighton and TECHNE with the paper Thomas and Austen, Queer Rural Histories and the Way They Are Catalogued. Thanks so much.
Hello everyone. I'm Tim. I'm a doctoral student with the University of Brighton. And for my PhD study, I'm aiming to undertake the first comprehensive study into queer histories of rural England, focusing on the period 1800 to 1950. And today I'm going to share one of my archival findings, that of Thomas and Austen, discuss how queer rural histories are catalogued and some of the challenges around that. So I'll start with a question I ask myself pretty much every day. Who am I and why am I doing this? So I'm an archivist, I'm a writer, I'm a historian. I'm coming at this topic from the angle of archives and collections. I tend to find things like queer theory to be a bit impenetrable, so my work is driven by findings in archives. So what got me interested in this topic was the fact that before my PhD, I worked for the Museum of English Rural Life, or MERL, in Reading, which aims to tell the social, cultural, and economic story of the English countryside. However, we didn't have any exhibitions or gallery content on queer histories, so I was in charge of putting that right. But when I looked through our collections catalogue, as you might imagine, I found absolutely nothing relating to LGBTQ people in the rural past. And if you think about it, that makes sense. The museum had never gone out of its way to collect that sort of material before, and donors of existing collections wouldn't have disclosed their sexuality when they donated their object. So at that point, I decided to look into secondary literature to see what research had already been done on rural queer histories in England. Now, this is what really surprised me, is that I couldn't find anything here either. There's been so much done on urban queer histories, but nothing on the rural. There are a couple of possible explanations for this. So firstly, most of the people doing this queer research were from sort of urban academic circles and were more inclined to do research that reflected their own experiences. And also there's a lot more archive material available in the urban context, such as evidence of gay activism in cities, as well as evidence of meeting spaces like gay clubs and bars. But still, the fact there was no literature on that topic at all in the English context did shock me. And I just couldn't get it out of my head that this was a huge gap in knowledge, so I jumped at the chance to do this PhD. So here's an example of something we did do while I was at the museum, an exhibition named Queer Constellations, where we used newspaper archives to find men convicted for homosexuality in rural villages, and we then found out their occupations, and so used our collections to illustrate their lives. And something I really liked about this part of the exhibition was that it consisted of plain brown working objects, and so deviated from the usual rainbow colours we'd associate with LGBTQ content. And it showed that the people we featured were just ordinary men with ordinary jobs. And alongside the collections items we had on display, we also had some contemporary artists and videographers displaying their work as well. And I think a couple of the people who displayed there are here today, which is wonderful. So I don't have time to go through all of my PhD findings so far, so I'll stick with one example, that of Thomas and Austen. So I discovered the story of these men while looking through diaries and correspondence from farms, which the museum holds. I find that these are the best records to search through when it comes to farm records, as they're the most likely to contain personal reflections and indeed gossip, which is what I'm looking for. I've already learned some really valuable lessons on how best to approach these kinds of sources. So as you can imagine, the vast majority of these archives aren't relevant to my research. I've developed a skill in skim reading for words that jump out at me. Anything to do with relationships, socializing, or even a criminal prosecution might lead me to read a document in greater detail. I've also made findings about which specific types of documents might be the most useful. So, for example, if a document is labelled a farm diary, then it'll typically just list the farm tasks that were completed on that farm on each day. However, if something is described as a diary of a farmer, then it's more likely to contain the thoughts of personal thoughts and reflections on activities or events. So my PhD doesn't just aim to find stories of historical queer people in rural England, but also to develop a methodology for future researchers. And that's why these sorts of findings are important, so that I can advise others on how best to do this research themselves. So on to Thomas and Austen, amongst correspondence relating to a farm called Vale Farm in Kent. When I was going through letters about farm tithes and rents and lots of other economic financial documents, I spotted the word intimate, which you obviously wouldn't expect to see in that sort of material. And the letter containing that word, which was dated to 1883, was sent by a man named Austen, living in Auckland in New Zealand, to William Champion, who was the farmer who owned Vale Farm in Kent. Within the letter, Austen describes his relationship with William's recently deceased brother Thomas. And the language he uses is indicative of a relationship between Austen and Thomas. Most notable was a request for the destruction of Austen's previous letters to Thomas, which, as I'm sure many of you know, is a telltale sign of a same-sex relationship, as letters were frequently used as evidence in convictions of gay couples. Thomas is also described as chief amongst my kind friends, and Austen asks for a photo of Thomas as a keepsake. As well as suggesting the existence of a relationship between the two men, the letter also implies something about how the rural community responded to them. Austen mentions that their relationship was subject to gossip amongst the community, amongst the village, and yet it seems nobody went to the police. So perhaps people in the countryside in the 1880s were a little bit more tolerant than we might expect. I also went to Ancestry to see if I could find out a bit more about the two of them, and worked out that whilst Thomas was a farmer like his brother, Austen was a chemist in Canterbury before he moved away to New Zealand. So I found this letter in the very first week of my archive research, and it gave me the belief that this work was worth doing, and there must have been many more others like these two out there. So here's the first page of Austen's letter. You might be able to see the word intimate about 8 lines down. There it is. And you can also see the request for the photograph and the demand for the destruction of letters. If you can see down here, it just says the word destroyed at the end of the sentence. Austen doesn't actually mention Thomas by name in the letters, so I had to piece that together from a number of other sources. So why is it that I had to sift through box after box of farm records to find this letter? Why couldn't I just look it up on the catalogue? And the reason is that the catalogue entry for this letter doesn't give any kind of indication that it implies a same-sex relationship between Thomas and Austen. Specifically, it doesn't contain any words that researchers of LGBTQ plus histories are likely to be searching for, whether those are modern or historic words relating to homosexuality. The only word that might suggest such a thing is the inclusion of the word friend in the description field. So perhaps that's something to take away from it, that word in this time period can indicate something more than platonic. But if you're expecting every document containing the word friend to contain queer histories, you're going to find, obviously, a lot of red herrings as well. Looking into the background of this collection makes it fairly obvious that the original cataloguer wasn't expecting to find or searching for queer histories in this collection of rural archives. The Merle farm records were collected in the 1960s to serve as an economic history of farming, and any social history that comes through is something of a happy accident. Maybe the person who catalogued it didn't know how to spot the signs of queer history in archives like these, or maybe they didn't want the negative stigma associated with highlighting such a thing at the time. Something that's really fascinating about this case in particular is that I think the archivist knew that there was something special about this letter, So the majority of this collection is catalogued to file level, not to item level. But this letter is one of the very few that got its own unique catalogue entry. The archivist made this item stand out in quite a subtle way, but we'll never know for sure why they chose to do that. But this isn't just a historical issue relating to archives catalogued over 50 years ago. The question of whether or not archivists highlight LGBTQ material in their catalogues is something that goes unanswered to this day. Obviously, most archives want to improve engagement with all kinds of researchers, and so seek to improve the discoverability of marginalised histories. But this aim is sometimes ranged against the traditional archival principle of neutrality, that it's their duty to represent the past exactly as it's written in front of them and not to deal in speculation. And there's no doubt that speculation is a part of engaging with queer rural histories in particular. With the case of Thomas and Austen, I'm maybe 95% sure that there was something going on between them, but that's not 100%. And there's definitely something to be said about the fact that nobody can truly be neutral and everybody carries their own bias. But the truth is that many practicing archivists believe that it is not their job to perceive queer histories, and that should be up to researchers like me. And as someone who trained as an archivist myself, I do understand that cataloguing queer histories can be a scary thing to do. And I think some heritage professionals are worried about getting things wrong or offending people. And this is a conversation that I'm really keen to have with as many archivists as possible. I'm hoping to present at the annual conference of the Archives and Records Association next year on this theme of neutrality and discoverability. So even if archivists do decide they want to highlight queer histories, we need to think about the best way to do it. One really exciting way I've observed is through tagging. So for example, attaching the tag LGBTQ plus history to a catalogue record, so that when someone searches for that term, LGBTQ plus, or some variant of it, this record will come up without the term appearing in the description of the catalogue entry itself. So here's just an excerpt of the catalogue record for Austen's letter. As you can see, it does mention the destruction of letters, which is the strongest indicator of the relationship, but you can't really expect people to be typing in that exact combination of words, like letters to the brother will be destroyed, in order to get that letter to come up in their search. So finally, I just wanted to briefly mention some of the other challenges of this research, some of which are also related to the way things are catalogued and curated. Most obviously, the lack of direct archival evidence means that I'm looking for needles in haystacks, which has become sort of a catchphrase for my project. So when searching for farm records, I'll have day after day of reading diaries and letters that have nothing to do with queer histories, and I think if I read one more diary entry of someone saying what kind of heron flew over their wheat field, I'll go completely mad. But to be honest, I suspected that I would find nothing at all of relevance in the farm records throughout my entire PhD. So to find Thomas and Austen, I was quite pleased with that. Next up is the issue of censorship, which is something I've unfortunately had to deal with recently. So attempts to remove or redact queer histories from an archive can occur before or after it is accessioned or catalogued. For example, I was intrigued to hear that the University of Reading, which is the Museum of English Rural Life is part of that, they'd acquired the papers of John Hampson, a queer writer who lived a rural existence. But there was a note in the accession file that stated that a family member had destroyed all the documents relating to homosexuality before the papers were donated, and so that history is lost forever. Also, one of the letters I found in the farm records couldn't be displayed in the museum as it's part of a collection on permanent loan, so it's not owned by the museum. And the owner, who is a descendant of one of the people mentioned in the letter, has political affiliations which would have made them unlikely to want to engage with a queer history project. So I won't go further into that case, but I do have plenty of thoughts on it. It's also an inescapable fact that plenty of archive collections are not catalogued to the level that archivists would want, due to time constraints and backlogs and all sorts of reasons. And this makes queer histories impossible to highlight on the catalogue. For example, I found a few documents showing evidence of same-sex affection towards a farmer from rural Oxfordshire, but the catalogue entry covering these documents also covered about 3 or 4 other boxes of loose correspondence. So when I wanted the relevant documents for display in the museum, I couldn't just ask the archivist to find it for me because it was impossible. I had to go into the boxes to find them myself because only I knew where that was. And the same collection also uses the word miscellaneous a lot, which I wanted to mention as it's a word that I used to absolutely despise when I worked in an archive, in a sort of an archive role, because I felt like if you had to catalogue something as miscellaneous, then you weren't really doing your job as an archivist. But now I actually get quite excited when I see the word miscellaneous, because it suggests that these documents have almost been marginalised from the structure of the archive itself. And if you're looking for marginalised histories, that seems like a good place to start. Terminology has also provided a multifaceted challenge throughout my project. Firstly, the terms within the records themselves. So when written by non-queer people, as I'm sure you know, records will often describe queer people in terms which are now slurs, which can provide a challenge for both researchers and for archivists, because modern researchers won't necessarily be typing slurs into the catalogue during their searches, and some archives and museums won't want these words on their websites at all through fear of reputational damage. And furthermore, documents written by queer people in the past usually use sort of euphemistic language to describe their sexual activities and romantic desires due to fear of discovery, and also because queer people simply didn't have the array of terms that we have now to identify themselves. And this makes searching for keywords more difficult and contributes to the issue of speculation that I mentioned earlier. So finally, I also struggle with working out which terms I should be using to describe the people I find, because I usually end up using words that the individuals wouldn't have used themselves. So the question over whether it's disingenuous to call Thomas and Austen a gay couple when they lived 100 years before the word gay acquired its modern meaning. At the same time, if I use a more academic term, like one I've had recommended is sexually dissonant or romantically dissonant, I risk turning away the sort of wider, more general audiences that I really want to communicate with. So these are the sorts of conversations that I have to have with myself quite a lot. So yeah, that's it from me. Thank you very much for listening, and please do get in touch if you want to discuss anything.
Thanks so much, Tim. Fascinating contribution, not just from the content of the archives, but also methodology and reflections and on cataloging. Thank you so much. I think continuing on the theme of rurality, we'll move on to the next paper. So if I could invite Friday Schoemaker from Wiltshire Museum to present on Queer in Wiltshire, queering a county museum in a rural town. Thanks so much.
Right. Hi, everyone. I'm Friday Schoemaker, and my pronouns are they, them. And I will be discussing the Queer in Wiltshire project, which is a project I designed and ran at the Wiltshire Museum, a county museum in the conservative rural town of Devizes in Wiltshire. The project was a unique opportunity to create a queer project from scratch and an interesting case study for a queer project in the countryside. In my presentation, I'll be discussing the project from design and research to co-creation, resources, and the event program. So Queer in Wiltshire was an 8-month queer heritage and community project funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund, Community Fund, and Wessex Museums. And as part of the project, I created a 6-month community event program with various LGBTQI+ artist-led workshops and other queer events and activities, including craft sessions, movie nights, and more. And the project also resulted in multiple LGBTQI+ resources, including a queer heritage booklet and a co-produced exhibition, which you can see on the screen there. So when I first started working at Wiltshire Museum, I went up to our curator and I asked if there were any queer stories in the archive or if the museum had ever hosted any queer events. And unsurprisingly, I was told there was no record of any. And I then kind of decided that I was going to change that, which was really the start of the project. So I wanted to create a project that met local queer communities' needs, helped build community, improved participants' well-being, and offered accessible resources that could be a source of queer representation and validation in a county that didn't have much of either. Throughout the project's 8-month run, we interacted with hundreds of people, worked with local queer groups, found and shared more queer stories than I could have ever imagined going into a project. As an example of this, when I started writing this, I was expecting to find about 10 pages worth of information, and it ended up being about 56 pages, so that was a very pleasant surprise for me. And we received an overwhelmingly positive response from visitors, participants, and the general public. And we also attended Devises Pride, where we handed out our heritage booklets and created badges, which you can see right there. And on the slide, you can see some of the feedback we received from visitors, which included, it was a great experience and very cathartic in a relaxed environment. We need so much more of this to balance the actual history of our community, and I think a project like this should be done in every county. And you can also see there, those were t-shirts that we made with our LGBTQI+ advisory group. I'm also wearing one today. And the design was inspired by the kinds of badges that you would see as part of the gay liberation movement. So we produced actual small badges with the exhibition name on them and took pictures of them. All of our advisory group members got one of the badges used for the design, and then we printed off some limited edition t-shirts to promote the project. And we also did other promotional activities, including distributing leaflets, social media marketing, and I wrote an opinion piece for Diva magazine, which was a personal highlight for me. So I started my queer work at Wiltshire Museum by trying to locate and research queer stories in the museum's archive and collection. And this was an important step in demonstrating the museum's dedication to sharing queer histories, experiences, and identities, and building relationships with the local LGBTQI+ community. Finding queer stories and queer in your museum can be a very difficult task, especially when you're working at a small museum in the Wiltshire countryside that focuses primarily on prehistory, archaeology, and local history. But using my knowledge of queer history and historical figures, I located several queer histories at the museum and across Wiltshire by researching famous LGBTQI+ historical figures like Anne Lister and discovering their connections to the area, looking for works by queer authors and artists like Stephen Tennant within our collections, and finding queer stories in our newspaper archive. Some of my favorite queer finds in our collections included a signed copy of a book of poems by Stephen Tennant, who was part of the Bright Young Things, as well as a fantastic 1897 biography. Oh, okay. 1897 biography of a famous Sapphic couple written by a distant Victorian relative who lived in Wiltshire. I found the biography hidden in our archive, I think 2 days before I was set to send off a booklet to the printers, but it was so fascinating that I ended up writing another 3-page essay about the booklet, about it for the booklet. And the biography included an excellent and iconic description of the couple's relationship, with their Victorian relative writing, "For some reason, the romantic attachment of these two ladies was looked upon with disfavor by their friends and opposed in every way. But when Miss Ponsonby came of age, her movements were not interfered with, for she joined her friend in London. For 2 years, they both went into society and were the gayest of the gay." And he unknowingly really hit the nail on the head there. So for the booklet, my research included objects with explicit links to queer historical figures, as well as the recontextualization of objects by looking at them through a queer lens. And contemporary history was also an essential part of the Queer in Wiltshire project. Working with local communities, we located queer histories through co-production activities, museums first, explicitly queer acquisitions, and crucially, oral history interviews. So in creating Queer in Wiltshire, my biggest goal was to create a safe and welcoming space for LGBTQI+ visitors across the Wiltshire area. As we all know, queer histories and identities have historically been erased and censored, and many LGBTQI+ people still feel like museums and heritage spaces are not for them. So by demonstrating our commitment to sharing queer stories and actively seeking feedback from the community through surveys, social media, and our LGBTQI+ advisory group, we slowly built relationships with the local queer community and showed them that the Queer in Wiltshire project was a space by and for queer people. Furthermore, we collaborated with local LGBTQI+ community groups, offering the museum and project as kind of a resource and physical meeting space for them, which a lot of queer community groups have said can be very hard to find these days. And as part of our event program, we also worked with 6 different local LGBTQI+ artists who ran a variety of workshops, including a queer nature walk and queer poetry and queer explorative movement sessions. And this part of the event program was really important to me personally because I wanted to make sure that I was also creating opportunities for other queer creatives in the area with this funding that we received. So the top picture is one of the artist workshops, and then the bottom picture is one of our movie nights where we watched Pride, which is a great film. So co-production was a key part of the Queer in Wiltshire project. We set up a small LGBTQI+ advisory group who co-produced our exhibition and helped inform project events and activities. We kind of created a framework for our queer advisory group members, allowing them to share and explore their ideas and create an exhibition that reflected their interests. As mentioned before, contemporary collecting was an essential part of our research, and by recording local LGBTQI+ people's oral histories, we were able to reflect a wide spectrum of queer identities and experiences in our resources, and give our queer visitors a platform to share their stories. Our oldest interviewee was born in 1937, and his story includes his experience growing up as a gay teenager in the 1950s, being prescribed aversion therapy by his GP, meeting his partner in the 1960s, who is still his partner to this day, and their marriage in 2014. And other interviews include stories of coming out as trans in your 40s, queer parenthood, trans healthcare, queer self-discovery and community, LGBTQI+ dementia, love and loss. And working closely together with the local queer community through our co-production activities and oral history recordings helped us really capture unique perspectives and unexplored histories. So there you can see 2 of our queer advisory group members, and we all kind of went on collective little field trip to the Bishopsgate Institute to try to find more queer stories in Wiltshire. And the top picture is a little mind map we created because I'm a very mind mappy person, and I thought it would help us kind of explore ideas for the exhibition. So the Queer in Wiltshire project resulted in the co-produced We Have Always Been Her exhibition, which explored themes including queer community, LGBTQI+ identity and expression, queer healthcare and stigma, discrimination and progress. Wiltshire Museum is in a very rural kind of conservative area, so rather than going deep into queer theory and things like that, we decided to keep it somewhat basic in a way for visitors who had no knowledge of queerness and the queer community, while also still trying to share stories that our advisory group wanted to share. In addition to this, I shared our research on the Queer in Wiltshire Instagram, which is just @QueerInWiltshire if you're interested in following us, and created the Queer in Wiltshire, Queering Wiltshire heritage booklet, which includes my queer research, information about the museum's first queer acquisitions, artwork by our queer visitors, which was created at different events, and oral histories from LGBTQI+ people across Wiltshire. And I've brought a few copies of the booklet along today, so please let me know if you'd like a copy. We originally printed 350 copies, and we only have about 20 left at the museum. So I took 8, and I've already handed out a few, so I only have 3. But if you happen to be in the Devizes area, you can probably pop into the museum and get a copy as well. They are available at reception, and they are completely free. You can also read the booklet online for free on the Wiltshire Museum website. Just Google it. Both our physical and online resources include various content warnings and explain our use of the word queer across the project. The word queer obviously has a painful and complex history, and in our resources and on the Wiltshire Museum website, we explain that we use the word not seeking to erase or disregard anyone's identity and history, but instead aiming to reflect the diversity of the LGBTQI+ community. And our resources have been very well received and have helped us grow our LGBTQI+ audience and promote the project. Lastly, I wanted to briefly discuss how we approached accessibility and well-being as part of our project. In creating the project, I wanted to ensure that all of our events, activities, and resources were free and accessible to LGBTQI+ people across and beyond Wiltshire. We worked with various disabled artists and included intersectional and neurodivergent stories in our resources. And we also worked hard to protect the well-being of both our visitors and staff. So this meant we carefully monitored our social media comments, protecting our visitors from harmful and offensive comments, which unfortunately we did receive a few of those because it's Wiltshire and it's our world. And we also included various content warnings, as I said, and a list of community and mental health resources in the back of the Queer Heritage booklet. And additionally, for me personally, the project included several mental health check-ins, especially after oral history recording sessions, as these often focused on very sensitive topics. I think it's quite a common thing in the heritage world, especially queer heritage, for only one or a few people to be kind of driving the queer research. And, you know, we have a staff of only 12, 13-ish people. So that person was me, which was a huge plus because it meant I kind of got like £20,000 and I got to do whatever I wanted, and any idea I had kind of take it out of my head and turn it into reality, which was really a really cool opportunity. But on the flip side of that, it also meant that I was carrying all the work, everyone's stories, all of the negative comments, which could be quite overwhelming. So if you're doing something like this and you're doing it by yourself or with only a small team, make sure that you also, you know, protect your own mental health. Yeah, the Queer in Wiltshire project was a really unique opportunity to create a queer project at a museum that previously had no history of queer events or research in a rather conservative rural town. And ultimately, the project allowed us to build relationships and connect with the local LGBTQI+ communities across Wiltshire and provide a platform for underserved communities and record important and historically censored queer histories, experiences, and identities for generations to come. And I thought I would conclude my presentation with an excerpt from our interview with 88-year-old David, who said, "Really, within the last 30 years, the change has been utterly remarkable. I am now in a state of security where I won't accept tolerance. I won't accept ordinary acceptance. If someone occasionally says something homophobic, I will be at their throat and say, I've not spent an entire life as a gay person to suffer these insulting remarks now. But it has got so much better. I can remember a situation, it might have been our civil partnership, saying, I can't believe that this is happening. From my teenage years, when I was so depressed and treated as a criminal, here I am being able to have a public partnership. I remember getting tears in my eyes. One of the registrars, when we converted to a marriage, said, I used to work for the police department and I used to prosecute people in your position, and now here we are having a marriage ceremony. And I thought, yes, that's about it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Friday. It's so great to hear about the behind the scenes of the booklet. I know we've circulated it through the newsletter before, but we'll make sure to do that again once we share more of the recordings from this event. And thanks for bringing the physical copies as well. So we're on to the final session, the final presentation of this session. So if I could invite Celine, Simon, and Lauryn to join me for a final presentation titled Ertach Zhoosh. I'm sure you'll tell us more about it.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Sorry. Just dance around each other.
Thanks for having us. My name's Celine Elliott. My pronouns are she, her. And I'm the National Youth Partnership Manager at English Heritage.
I'm Lauryn Etheridge, pronouns she, her. I was the interpretation manager at English Heritage for this project.
What are you now?
Oh, and now I'm at the RHS. Hi.
And this is...
Hi, and I'm Simon Clark. I'm a senior lecturer in fine art at Falmouth University, pronouns he, him.
So just a note on the name. So this is a Cornish name with the translation there, and it was a deliberate decision by us to use Cornish language basically as a challenge to working at English Heritage, at an English Heritage site in Cornwall. So Ertach means heritage in Cornish, and we unified it with the queer associated word to Zhoosh, to enhance or to improve. And we'd also just like to offer really special thanks to the Queer Heritage Collections Network, not just for inviting us, but this project was initiated as part of an unsuccessful bid to the Queer Heritage Collections Network, but we are really grateful for the provocation, and it's led us to go on to do this work. So, yeah, it's delightful to be here.
Thanks, Celine. Okay, so Pendennis Castle, or what we now know this as, is an artillery fort constructed by Henry VIII near Falmouth in Cornwall in the 1540s. It formed part of the King's Device programme to protect against invasion from France and the Roman Empire following Henry's break with the Catholic Church. Pendennis saw service during the English Civil War. It was modernised during the Napoleonic Wars and was rearmed during the First and Second World Wars when it saw action against German aircraft. And this brings us to the present day, when the castle is managed by English Heritage, seeing anywhere around 75,000 visitors a year.
So, as you might expect, with a nearly 500-year-old castle, conservation work is essential. And recently, in the build-up to an extensive and urgent large-scale conservation project, interpretation and youth engagement teams at English Heritage have begun work with artists and local creatives to explore new ways to better understand the site in relation to the exploration and use of places by local young people. Specifically, we wanted to know how applying a queer lens as part of artist practice could reveal different approaches to exploring the site and its stories. Until recently, the interpretation and subsequent storytelling surrounding the castle has been normative and almost entirely militaristic, told exclusively through the timeline starting with the Tudor construction, with additional information surrounding the use of the keep during wartime. Indeed, during the most recent market research with local people about the site, when asked what sprang to mind when thinking about Pendennis, their memorable response, "Guns, guns, guns," was one of the answers given. This isn't without reason. Under Things to See and Do, the webpage for the site currently suggests we marvel at the display of big guns in between enjoying gorgeous coastal views and having family fun.
We began by contacting local partners who we thought could potentially enjoy exploring the site and help us to understand it through new and different perspectives. Falmouth University, billed as Cornwall's leading university for the creative industries, and it is Simon, is within walking distance to the castle. As student numbers have grown, so has the pressure on already limited studio space. We suspected that the option to spill over and out into the castle might be welcomed by students and tutors alike. Initial invitations to visit were well received. Far from all students or tutors had visited the site previously, and they were intrigued and inspired by the building and its setting. There's a bit of a note on the location here. The castle sits on a peninsula. It's surrounded on 3 sides by the sea, and it's at the mouth of the Fal estuary, which is the deepest in Europe. It's a monument to Henry's paranoia, and the very real threat of climate change is accelerating the necessary conservation work. And this was the catalyst for our first site intervention with staff and students, a one-day response by first-year fine arts students to the challenge of the climate emergency at the site.
This was a photo I took during the event Lauryn just told you about, of a student's notebook, after I'd spoken to the group about the purpose of English heritage and our ambition to welcome and increase active participation at the site by the students and their tutors. The castle is understood to be a visitor attraction, but I think here it might be worth mentioning the hope we have for the site to become an active part of the creative ecosystem in Cornwall, one that nourishes emerging artists, contributes to the professional practice of those more established creatives, and is fundamentally open to ideas. It's also about reframing the organisation, moving away from one that is a gatekeeper of knowledge and understanding, and towards one that's about becoming curious and questioning. History doesn't need to be threatened by new perspectives, as we know. It can be enriched. And working with the students, we began to see new possibilities. The site manager, Kirsty, remembered how the students used the site in a different way, one that we couldn't have imagined.
The next event we programmed together with the students was the second-year Fine Art End-of-Year Show, always a big event in their calendar, where they celebrate and share work and welcome people, their families, friends, and the wider public to see what they've produced. In the first image, you can see on the left the castle behind a pointed wooden sign in the foreground which reads the Village Public House. Interestingly, more recently, historians at English Heritage have shared information with us about an on-site brewery, so it turns out this isn't so left field. On the right, we look through into the castle where we can see an image of ravers from the 1990s. Let us know if you were there. While seemingly incongruous, this room would have been a hub of activity in the keep's heyday. And more recently, the wider site was infamous for open-air cliffside raves in the 1990s at the evocatively named Half Moon Battery, an 18th century crescent-shaped coastal defence on the south side of the castle.
The second-year students' final year show opened on May the 1st, always an auspicious date in the Cornish calendar, with summer being welcomed in various pagan traditions, and the site was transformed by the students. No corner of it was left unchanged, and the imagination and interpretation by the group was limitless. I really like this because it just captures the joyous atmosphere of the night. Our specific interest in queer interpretation of the site has begun to emerge organically. A particular favourite of mine, these images show work by Martha Stone. This work presents a challenge. Contrasting against the hard metallic gun display, the soft limbs caress the barrels, disrupting the expectations of the visitor to the site, juxtaposing sharply, or maybe that should be softly, with the narrow militaristic presentation. Tim touched on this yesterday, and Friday has just spoken about language sensitivity. But I think this speaks to our own broad understanding of the term queer. In their language statement, the local LGBTQ+ heritage organisation Queer Kerno reminds us that the word queer can be viewed as quite a contentious word, and since its first recorded use in 1513, queer came to mean anything that was not normal, something odd or set apart from the status quo. Inviting the students in to explore the site without prescribing its use, simply creating space for exploration yielded rich results. A significant part of the planned conservation project the site needs relates to interpretation. Working in this way with the university led us to identify that we couldn't do the work without them. The stimulation of the site needed their fresh interpretation and understanding, which reanimated it entirely. So frequently, heritage engagement leads to spaces being nullified by accident, and the narratives become smooth or linear and simplified. But we know the past as much as the present isn't like this.
So one of the English heritage historians, Will Wyeth, has offered an alternative reality. People of all sorts of ages and disabilities probably existed here at one point or another. The presence of large groups of people necessitates the emergence of friendships, rivalries, relationships, fallouts and breakups. It also means songs, stories, games, tricks, traditions and senses of community. The permission to explore the site physically and creatively, unfettered by expectation, was taken further by Dr. Simon Clark, Senior Lecturer in Fine Art at Falmouth University, and we're really delighted to have you with us today.
Thank you. Can I grab this? Thanks. Hi, everyone. So what's been super exciting about this project is that it's an invitation to test out queering strategies and what this queer lens might look like. So for me, this is very much a work in progress. There's no final outcomes. I'm kind of allergic to sort of finishing things. So this has been absolutely perfect for me to just test out a series of processes and to see where it might go. We included some local partners, so Art Centre Penryn and Falmouth Art Gallery. I'll talk about them presently. So as you've already heard, the castle is very much built as like a biopolitical structure that polices and protects a sense of this sovereign Englishness against some foreign other. And I immediately wanted to complicate that by introducing the figure of the monster queer. I'm doing loads of research about queerness as a monstrous slipperiness, something that invades and transgresses boundaries, that refuses to be categorized, that slips and breaches and oozes and squelches. And I look at lots of horror films to sort of devise this sense of queerness. If you're interested in that, there's a lovely book called Monsters in the Closet by Harry M. Benshoff. That's been really important to me. So I initially wanted to introduce this monster figure into some workshops that I was doing with a group of young people from Splanner, which is a youth group at Falmouth Art Gallery. So we got the English Heritage guidebook, we ripped it up into pieces, and we made these kind of hybrid monster figures as collages. This was the first session at Falmouth Art Gallery, and then we went on site at Pendennis, and we started projecting these monsters into the space. I actually built a wearable projector that you could walk around with and sort of beam the monsters into this space. And these are all reworkings of the English Heritage booklet. So straight away we're thinking about sort of trying to devise and rewrite those kind of familiar, entrenched normative narratives that typically confront the viewer. I also did a future-facing myth with the young people, so I invited them to imagine the future of Pendennis Castle. And they told this brilliant story of Pendennis Castle being overtaken by AI Lego robots. They pull the castle to pieces, build a new castle. Meanwhile, there's a beautiful queer relationship between a microwave and a monster. They fall in love, and when the microwave finally dies and explodes, a meteor comes down and crashes into the Lego castle, returning it back to a state of ruin. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And then we also did what we called the stairwell quarter-walling. And we had 3 different groups of young people on each level of the castle. And then the invitation was just like, make some noise. Just be feral, be wild. And they kind of passed a noise up and down the stairwell. And at one point there was Backstreet Boys and some Celine Dion. This is just a tiny little snippet of them. I'm aware of time, so I'm not going to play the whole thing. And at that point, I was sort of slightly embarrassed because I sort of lost control of the group. And after that, they all just went piling outside and were doing roly-polies down the hill. And Celine assured me that that was kind of perfect. It was a perfect ending to the day. And then I wanted to take this idea of their future myth really seriously. So thinking about a myth as something that gives us the language and the vocabulary to think differently about the present situation we're in. So I was thinking to myself, what are they telling us? What are these young people telling us by these constant destructions and explosions? And I think they were really telling us with that story that they wanted to break down and pull apart those received heteronormative stories that they hear about the castle and remake their own narratives, remake their own stories in a participatory, playful way. So I for a conference paper, I did a very close critical analysis of their future myth, taking it really seriously in terms of what it can teach us about heritage. I also worked with a group of young artists who had graduated from Falmouth University. So whilst they were still at university, they'd been part of a queer group of students who were challenging some of the ableist structures at the university. And I put a call out to a whole group of alumni students, but it was actually this group who sort of responded mostly. So there's about 10 or so young people. And we did a series of playful workshops, kind of draping ourselves over the cannons. We got really fascinated with the cannons as a percussive object and as an acoustic object. We sort of spent lots of time singing to each other to the cannons. But we found this incredible photograph. So this ball used to be mounted on top of the castle, and it would drop at 1 p.m. every afternoon so that all the ships moored in the bay could set their timepieces by Greenwich Mean Time. So it's this real sort of marker of authoritative chronological time. And we loved how sort of wonky and shonky and awkward and queer this object looked. And we decided to work with that and play with that and respond to that in some way. So we came up with a proposal for a different type of ball. We were thinking about this idea of queer time, so a sort of time that might disrupt or interrupt chronological sequential time with loops, with bendiness and repetition and glitching. So we built a ball that would bounce up and down over and over again. It wouldn't just drop at a specific time. It could be activated by participants to just be this constant bouncy queer thing. I also imagined, so I'm a singer as part of my art practice. So I imagined myself as a lichen figure. I'm going to talk about lichen in a moment. I imagined myself as a lichen on the surface of the castle, sort of coming to life and singing a song. I've written that song. It's called Queer Love is Magic, and I'm going to play out that song in a moment. So this is a proposal of something I hope to do at the castle, if they ever have me back. I'm not sure, hopefully. The lichen figure is really important because as soon as you go into the castle, even though it's this idea of being a protected, sovereign, pure space with these very particular narratives, it's actually teeming with queerness already. The castle itself is a queer ecology. The lichen itself is a beautiful example of that. An algae and a fungi have got together and intermingled and authored something new. And we touched on the vulnerability of the site. There's beautiful rust, there's beautiful damp marks. So this is a space that's already infiltrated. It's this porous, slippery, queer space that's hosting all sorts of beautiful ecologies. So I got really excited by this idea of thinking of the castle itself as a queer ecology. Book. If you're interested in that, there's this beautiful textbook called Queer Ecologies, a series of writers that look about queerness, productivity, generation beyond heteronormative notions of reproduction. And queer time, queer becomings. If you're interested in this idea of bendy, loopy time that breaks heteronormative chronology, that's a great one. And also Cruising Utopia has been very important to my research. So we did a residency at Penryn Arts Centre, which is a beautiful old Methodist church that's being converted into an art centre for the local community in Penryn. Penryn is a town just right next door to Falmouth. So I was lucky enough to have a residency there, and we built our kind of queer bouncy ball. It's just wrapped in tin foil, like super budget, super lightweight, but it's suspended on two sort of bungee cables, so it kind of bounces up and down. I then did an exhibition of the object, but it's very clear that it's not a sculptural object. It doesn't exist in a gallery. It was passing through the gallery. It was temporarily sort of nesting there on its way to the roof of the castle. So basically it needs two people to hold each post, and then you tighten the bungee cord and you get a rhythm going that sort of bounces up and down. This is a few pictures of the ball in action, bouncing in the gallery space. And then we finally walked it to the castle. So this is a group of the artists I was collaborating with. We did a little procession walking the ball. And you can see here, this is the ball bouncing on the roof. It was completely windy and impossible to manage. It was quite a challenging day, and the ball actually got sort of torn to shreds by the wind. But it was a lovely thing to test and to experiment with, and I love the idea of this becoming potentially a more permanent install that members of the public can just go into and play with and create this kind of bouncy sense of queer time. But I think now I'm just going to leave you with my song. It's half written, the words don't exist yet, so I'm sort of just going, no, 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 because I don't actually know what the words are yet. But I'm going to play that over the top of some of the GoPro footage that we shot on this day. We had a camera mounted to the silver ball, and that will give you some sort of sense of what happened. Okay, I think if I press it again, it should play. So this is Queer Love is Magic with the footage from that day. Just on the left, yeah?
Just on the left.
Yeah, thank you so much. Oh my gosh.
Magic with the sea is an illusion. Magic with the gay is a radical fusion. Queer love is magic with a K. Queer love is magic spell with a K. Queer love is magic with a K. Queer love is magic. Oh, oh, queer love is magic. Queer love is magic.
Snippets of the work in progress. And just really quickly, one of the things I just didn't say when I was talking about the work with the young people and the artists is that rather than this idea of reading and responding to heritage, we really wanted to create this idea of writing heritage through these coming togethers of activity, of play, of irreverence, exploration, that heritage itself is this kind of ecological queer space where disparate things come together, intermingle and play and generate new exciting things that sort of take us into the future. Thank you very much.